Hi everybody. By everybody, I'm pretty sure I just mean Sam. Don't know if anybody else will ever see this, but thanks for checking this out, Sam. I'm Jeremy Hogan, and today I'm going to talk to you about Dutch Elm Disease as part of our second applied assignment. So today we're going to talk about elm trees, what they look like, where they're from, why they are susceptible to Dutch Elm Disease, why we care about elm trees. We'll also talk about Dutch Elm Disease itself, what causes it, how it's transmitted, what vectors, both native and invasive, are the causes of the increase that we've seen in Dutch elm disease in both Europe and North America. And we'll talk about prevention and maintenance, how people are trying to stop the transmission, how people are trying to save trees that currently have Dutch elm disease, and how the future of elm trees might look. Okay, so elm trees are of the genus Ulmus. They first appear in the geologic record about 20 million years ago in Central Asia. Depending on which taxonomist you speak to, you might hear somewhere between 30 and 40 species. As with all taxonomy, it's quite messy once you dig into it. This is even more complicated because there's numerous cultivars because it's such a popular planting tree, and they hybridize quite readily. So you can have lots of interbreeding between species, and the lines are often blurred between where a species is distinct from another. They're found throughout temperate forests worldwide when they're not planted by humans. They're in North America, all the way from Florida up to kind of central Canada. Western Europe, they used to be abundant, not so much anymore. Central Asia and Southern Asia, temperate forests also have numerous species. And this is where the original founding elms were before they rapidly colonized temperate forests around the world. Where they are native, they're considered a keystone species. They're really important nesting and foraging trees for birds in particular. Baltimore Orioles, for example, are known to really like nesting in American elms and are affected when elms start dying back. Another interesting kind of symbiosis is with morel mushrooms. Morel mushroom hunters are pretty fanatical, and they make a lot of money, and they know to look for dead and dying elm trees to find their morels. They're also a very popular urban tree. Throughout North America and Europe, they've been planted for centuries because they have really nice leafy crowns that provide a lot of shade. As you can see in the bottom picture here, they're often lining streets for this really nice canopy effect. And they do have lumber and medicinal uses as well. Okay, so what makes them popular? They grow fast. They grow 2 to 3 feet a year under optimal conditions. They can reach heights of over 30 meters. 35 meters for many species is kind of the standard. They're a large vase-shaped canopy, so you get this kind of spreading effect at the top, and it keeps them clear of a lot of low-hanging brush until they really spread out up high, which makes for a really nice shade tree and a really nice aesthetic when you plant them in a row along a road, for example. They're deciduous, they are wind dispersed, both in terms of their pollen and their seeds, and they're a very hardy and tolerant tree, so that's why they survive quite well in places like Calgary. But the one thing they do require is good drainage. Why are we talking about elm trees? Well, because a lot of them died in the 1900s. This was the time when international shipping really took off around the world. You could ship large things on large ships using steam power and things like that. And once this started happening, you started having introduction of pests and diseases from around the world into species of native plants and animals that were unable to cope. In the early 1900s, elms were one of, if not the most popular street planted tree throughout the US, particularly in the Northeast. And in around 1910, people started to notice that elm trees in Ohio specifically were starting to die off. Nobody really knew why. It was unexplained at the time, but by the time it kind of started slowing in the 1970s, there were 77 million trees dead, quite a lot. Europe sees a little bit of mortality around the same time in elm trees, but nothing quite on the scope and scale that the US was experiencing. However, about 30 years later, in the 40s, they did start to see an uptick that really surged in the 60s and 70s. By the time it was all said and done, the second wave, 25 million trees in the UK were dead. Just to give perspective on that number, in France it's estimated that 97% of elm trees were killed. And Germany is even more staggering. They estimate that 90% of native elm trees had been felled by humans throughout river valleys and things like that. So there was only 10% of the original stand still remaining by the time the second wave hit. And then 90% of those survivors died. So there's less than 1% of elm trees alive in Germany that there were prior to the 1940s. What was happening to these elm trees? Luckily, there was a breakthrough in terms of women's rights in the 1920s in the Netherlands, and the first female professor was hired, and that was Johanna Westerdijk. She was a biologist specializing in tree fungus symbioses and things like that. And she had a group of all-female PhD students working with her. They were assigned the task of trying to figure out what was happening to these elm trees. Bea Schwartz, seen in the middle picture here, was the first to discover that all of these elm trees were dying because of a fungus. Christine Buisman came on the scene a few years later and was also instrumental. So that's the reason that this disease is known as Dutch elm disease. Not because it originated in the Netherlands, not because a lot of trees died in the Netherlands, although they did, but because the root cause, pardon the pun, of this elm dieback was by a group of Dutch scientists. And this is the cause of it all, a fungus called Ophiostoma. Ophiostoma is native to Central Eastern Asia, where it overlaps with native elms. Those elms will be infected but will not die. They have a lot of resistance. They seem to kind of partition off the infection early, and they might lose a few limbs, but it won't kill the entire tree. However, it was a different story once this fungus was introduced to both Europe and North America. North America particularly, American elms were extremely susceptible to Ophiostoma almi, and almost all of them die once infected. European species of elms are a little hardier. I should also note at this time that even though we call it Dutch elm disease, there's a sister genus called Zelkova that is also susceptible to Ophiostoma. The second species was Ophiostoma novo almi. It was actually introduced to North America from Central and Eastern Asia. Japan is proposed to be the origin of it. And then it went from North America to Europe, so it kind of took a very meandering path to Europe. And once there, it proved to be much deadlier than Ophiostoma almi and wiped out most of Europe's elm stands. It is just as deadly to American elms as well, but because Ophiostoma almi took such a toll, it wasn't noticed quite as quickly in North America. How does it get from tree to tree? There's a couple different ways. Root grafting occurs in elms, so if they're planted close enough together, they will actually join roots to shunt nutrients and water to each other. This is known as grafting. The fungus is able to colonize the roots and then transfer from a diseased tree to a healthy tree, and then both are in trouble. But most commonly, it's the work of bark beetles. So in Europe and Asia, there are multiple Scolitis species of beetles. This is pictured in the bottom here, even though this one is from New Zealand. Scolitis is a really nice vector. They feed on healthy trees, and they lay their eggs and overwinter in diseased and dying trees. So during this cycle, they will pick up some of the fungus while they're overwintering or once they're hatched, and then they'll fly to a healthy tree and feed on the new branches that are formed in the spring. And in doing so, they'll accidentally inject a little bit of the fungus into the healthy tree, thus infecting it. What kind of signs can you look for to determine whether an elm is infected with Dutch elm or not? Beetle galleries are not necessarily indicative of Dutch elm infection. It just means that beetles have been there. But if you're seeing beetles, there is a noted trend that typically once Scolitis, which is invasive to North America, is seen in a region, within about a decade, you start to see Dutch elm disease as well. So an early sign is that there are beetle galleries in your trees. Actual Dutch elm disease signs, however, are things like you start to see wilted leaves on a single upper branch, typically early in the summer when trees should be in full blossom and the leaves should be flush. And then soon after this, you'll see other branches follow. The leaves wilt and turn yellow and then die. If you were to open up the tree, you find a lot of this dark brown streaking in the sapwood, and we'll explain that during the symptoms. And if you were an elm tree, what kind of symptoms would you be experiencing, and what kind of prognosis would you face? Well, neither one is great. First thing that happens is when the beetles infest the tree and the fungus is deposited, the fungus will start spreading throughout the xylem. The tree, in an immune response, starts to produce gum and tyloses to quarantine the infection. You can see tyloses in this bottom picture. Unfortunately, in a lot of elm trees, this walling off will actually totally close off the xylem entirely, and that stops all water and nutrient flow up the tree. So that's why you see these branches up high dying first. They're basically being starved of water. This causes the leaves to die. Once you have no leaves, your roots start to starve, and then the whole tree dies away. A small or otherwise unhealthy tree typically will only survive 1 or 2 years after being infected with Dutch elm disease. Bigger, more established trees will die back within 2 to 5 years, but often their roots will survive and can persist for decades. You'll see suckers produced yearly by these roots. Unfortunately, the suckers never really get too far. 15 years tops is kind of the standard before reinfection by Dutch elm occurs and those suckers die off and the whole cycle starts again. So what makes you more or less susceptible to Dutch elm disease if you're an elm tree? There are certain species and certain trees within species that have a natural fungal resistance, it seems. They will not be colonized even when inoculated. There are temperature and light constraints to the fungus, so the fungus spreads more rapidly at latitudes that have longer day lengths and warmer temperatures. So the further north in Canada you go, theoretically, the safer the trees will be. The beetle preferences also account for a lot of the transmission risks because they're the major vector of spread. So beetles prefer unhealthy trees. They're easier to feed on, for example. Certain elm species will produce chemicals to resist beetle attack known as triterpenes. Beetles will avoid these. Again, the same as the fungus, the beetles have specific latitude and altitude preferences. They also have different species detection capabilities. So certain elms aren't recognized by the beetles based on their crown shape and size. And then there's a lot of human impacts as well. If you plant your elms too close together, for example, the roots will graft and then the fungus can spread that way. Leaving dead and decaying wood around gives the opportunity for beetles to lay their eggs and continue the spread. So what do we do about this? It's obviously a very serious issue. The biggest response from humans is our physical management tools. So early detection, there are inspections that go throughout cities in Canada. There's seasonal pruning bans to stop the dead wood from piling up and allowing beetles to reproduce. Trees that are infected typically are culled to prevent further spread. You can cut limbs back 10 to 15 feet below the signs of infection, and that can be successful. And then limbs need to be properly disposed of. Typically, this is either burning or burying. Biologically, there's some pretty interesting controls. There is a virus that will infect the fungus, and they're known as D-infections. This plays a large part in the Asian control of native ophiostoma. You can control the beetles since they're a major vector. There are these things like pheromone bait traps where the beetles will hatch, and instead of finding a new elm tree, they'll fly into the traps and die. Fungicide is effective, but it's also expensive and time consuming, and only works for a couple of years, and then you have to redo it. So it's not all that effective in the grand scheme of things. It's only done for really important trees. Probably the most promising direction is the crossbreeding of trees that have been found to have a high resistance to Dutch elm disease. This takes decades to successfully do. We now have about a dozen or so species that are proven resistant cultivars, and they are only getting better. All right, so where does this leave us? What does it look like? Will elms survive? The good news is that when you look at the genetics, there doesn't seem to be a bottleneck, and this is because with those established trees, even though you do see the tree itself dying back, the roots persist, so those genes are still in the ecosystem. And absolute numbers are increasing because we now know how to manage Dutch elm a little better, and there's a lot of planting efforts with resistant trees going on. Control efforts have helped because it's being taken seriously. It's a well-studied, well-funded phenomenon. And there is a lot of progress in getting on top of control. The bad news, however, is that we haven't figured out a way to stop it or cure it effectively. We don't understand the genotype of the elm trees themselves, so we don't really know. Even though we can breed resistant trees, we don't know what the gene is that's causing that resistance. Accidental transmission is still highly likely as lumber is shipped internationally. New vectors are constantly being introduced. New beetles are arriving around the world. And unfortunately, the fungus mutates rapidly, so even the resistant species we have bred ultimately may prove to be susceptible to a future mutation. To sum it all up, Dutch elm disease is incredibly deadly to elm trees, and it wiped out over 90% of the elms in the non-native range of Europe and North America that ophiostomas were introduced to, and it continues to be a serious issue. We do have some tools to curb its spread, and we are doing a better job of keeping elms alive now, but very few of these are natural. You don't see forests dominated by elms anymore. So what you do see are cloned resistant cultivars, and the question is that a suitable replacement to these natural forests? Thank you very much for your attention and your time. I look forward to hearing your feedback.